through. So absolutely brilliant to have you here. A couple of little housekeeping questions. So at the end, I am going to give you I'm going to let you know how I'm going to get the workshop pack to you, which has got all the goodies that you need from everything that I'm going to talk about in this workshop. So it's got live links to resources. It's got checklists of strategies. So you don't really have to write anything down. It probably is better if you do, but you don't really have to. Because it will be all in the post workshop pack. So that's really helpful. I've had lots of good feedback on that because I ran this exact workshop a couple of weeks ago. So hopefully I will do a good job of delivering it again. I'm really excited to have you all here. So it's really good to get an idea of where you're all from. That's really, really helpful. Thank you for that. Okay, I am going to share my screen. And so hopefully you can still see me in the corner. You can. Yeah, that's good. So a few little sort of housekeeping things that we're going to go through. Obviously you're here for this webinar or this workshop. I hope you are. Teaching strategies for dyslexia. So the aim of this workshop is to give you practical advice to promote and enable progress in the classroom. I know that's really easy to say and not as easy to do. So you're going to come away from tonight with some clear strategies on the ways that you can use these bits of strategies and use resources and things that I'm going to suggest and put them into practice tomorrow if you so wish. So my name is Lizzie Shearing. I'm a specialist dyslexia teacher and I'm working with SEN Buddy at the moment. I've been teaching for 12 years. I've worked in 2 different settings. My first setting was a school where there was a really high ratio of children with the SEN. I think we had around 200 pupils on roll and we had a good 3/4 on the SEN register. So you kind of naturally had to get really good at differentiation, quality first teaching and understanding SEN profiles quickly so that it came, you've just got to be able to apply it there and then and kind of embed it in all of your planning. So really important that was part of my sort of early career because it sort of shaped what I do today, really. Excuse me. So I trained as a SENCO with the University of Birmingham in 2015. And then 3 years ago, I completed my level 7 postgrad certificate in dyslexia with Edge Hill University. And I'm happy to take questions on that as well. If anyone wants to ask me about the course or either of those 2 courses, because I see a lot of chat on Facebook, questions about courses and things. So feel free to ask me questions about that too. Before I go on to what you're going to learn in the workshop, couple of little housekeeping things. If you get cut off, don't worry, just click back on the link and it should bring you straight back in and no one will notice because it's only me that has the view of who's here. And if I get cut off, which has happened a couple of weeks ago, I had an absolute nightmare with my Wi-Fi, but I have upgraded it since and paid BT a lot of money. So if I get cut off, then just sit tight because I will be back. You can imagine I will be scrambling in the background to get back to you. And if all else fails, I do send out a replay anyway the next day. So don't panic if all goes wrong. You know what it's like with internet and Wi-Fi. It can't always go the way we want. I think COVID has taught us that. So by the end of this workshop, my aim is that you will feel totally clear on the most common difficulties dyslexic learners experience, and more importantly, what they're often so amazing at. I think it's really, really important that we don't ever forget those things. And in fact, they're crucial, and I'll come on to that later. I want you to understand how to implement activities in any lesson that will promote and enable learning for your dyslexic learners and your neurotypical pupils too. A lot of the strategies that I'm going to talk through tonight will enable you to actually kind of bring in the whole class into these strategies, and they will benefit everybody, but they will benefit your dyslexic learners the most. So they're quite good sort of catch-all strategies that have got a dyslexia focus. And I'm going to enable you to have a workshop pack of documents after the workshop that will enable you to put the strategies in place tomorrow. So you don't have to write anything down. There will be, I think there's sort of 3 different documents in there. There's a strategies list. There's links to all of the different resources that I'm going to talk about that are basically free and available and really amazing. So the workshop pack, I will talk to you about at the end, how to get that. So you need to stay until the end to get the workshop pack, and I will make sure that all of those people that stay all the way to the end will get that email to them. Please ask questions throughout on the Q&A. There is obviously a chat function, and I want your input all the way through. It doesn't matter whether you think I'm mid-flow or not. Go ahead and just ask anything you like in the chat, or throw something at me and I'll do my best to answer it. There is no such thing as a silly question. I ask silly questions on a daily basis, ask my husband and my colleagues. I think the more silly the question is, the more helpful it probably is. So you can take a pen and paper and make notes. If that's the best way for you to process information, then do that. That's great. And if you would share your sort of, I didn't realize that moments in the chat, or, oh, yeah, I've heard that before. That's really helpful. Or, oh, this is good. I like this. Anything like that. It encourages me. And the more excited I get, the better I present. I like to think that's the case anyway. You can tell me at the end if it was any good or not. Okay. Okay, so over to you for the first couple of minutes. Pressure straight on you. So what are the most common difficulties you see your dyslexic learners experience in your classrooms, or in any kind of setting, or any sort of, if you're a mum at home, then what are the difficulties you see at home or in the classroom? Could you write that in the chat? I'm going to give you a couple of minutes. If you're not sure, or you can't think of anything, that's absolutely fine. Just write, I'm not sure, but anything you can think of would be really helpful. So let's see what we've got. I'm going to have to just, where is my chat gone? There it is. Okay. Let's have a look. Never finishing the work. Yeah, Sally, that's very common. Lack of self-confidence, reluctant to try. I know, that's sad, isn't it? So common as well. Spelling and phonics, decoding and encoding, yeah, it's really tricky. Reluctant readers and writers, yes. Reading, writing, getting words down onto paper. I hear that all the time from the pupils I work with. I can work it out in my head, miss. I know what I want to say in my head, but I just can't get it on paper. Decoding difficulties when reading, yes. Becoming very overwhelmed easily, yes. And all the things I'm going to talk about will hopefully explain why that happens a little bit more. Accessing other areas of the curriculum, not just English yet, languages particularly challenging. Feeling afraid of making a mistake, yeah. Lack of confidence, letter word reversal, yeah. Short-term memory causes huge problems, Maria says, so we try and bypass long-term memory. Good, great strategy, and I'll talk about memory in a lot of detail in a moment. Reluctance to read, poor memory, frustrating that work takes so long. Yeah, amazing. You've all got such incredible insight. Visual stress, words running together, not finishing, poor self-esteem, spelling, tiredness. Yeah, I mean, it goes on, doesn't it? And ultimately, that's why we're all here, to try and help our pupils and the children that are close to us, you know, just to try and overcome some of these difficulties, because it's actually really difficult to watch dyslexic learners experience it as well. I've got a dyslexic husband, I've got a dyslexic brother, I've grown up around dyslexia, and it's, you know, they've come out as amazing adult individuals, but they both hated school. And so that's kind of part of my mission, to stop people from hating school that I work with. Talking about visual stress, just quickly, I think Mags Walton raised that. So visual stress, yeah, it's really common. Within the SEN Buddy membership, I'm going to talk to you briefly about that at the end. I've done a whole presentation, whole webinar on visual stress and visual difficulties, and how we can actually help to support our pupils with visual difficulties and the best ways to tackle that. Because first and foremost, visual difficulties need to be taken out of the equation and ruled out. So I am forever referring pupils to a behavioural optometrist for that reason. So yeah, that's just something worth noting. Good. And we've got and processing speed, Wilna completely right. Great. So there's an amazing sort of array of experience within this workshop, which is just fab. That's exactly what I was hoping to see. So I'm really glad that you all can have those experiences. Okay, So the first objective that I mentioned at the beginning was that I want you to feel totally clear on the most common difficulties dyslexic learners experience and what they're amazing at. So first and foremost, we know that dyslexia is very much a reading difficulty. It's very individual. It doesn't affect everyone in the same way. Certainly you can't say, well, dyslexia always affects pupils like this or individual people like this. It doesn't. It does have overlapping sort of comorbid difficulties with other SEN profiles, quite commonly ADHD, quite commonly autism spectrum, quite commonly dysgraphia, things like that. But most important thing to mention here is that it affects everybody very differently. There are general similarities, which I'm going to talk about here, but yeah, everyone is affected differently. So it basically, dyslexia is all about how an individual processes information, and dyslexia affects learning and how all of that information is processed, including oral instructions. So children with dyslexia specifically have difficulty with how they take information in, how they memorize that information, and then how they display that knowledge to others, whether that is in written form or verbal form, but usually in written form. And the thing that I'll sort of mention a few times this evening is that at school, obviously, pupils and children usually have to display what they know through the written format. That is just how our education system works at the moment. And that is usually a child with dyslexia, that is usually their most challenging method of displaying their knowledge. So it is no surprising that our dyslexic pupils and our dyslexic learners find schools so difficult very often. And, one of the things I hope that COVID is going to sort of kickstart, and I don't know whether you guys agree, but I really hope that COVID and the fact that we all as teachers and parents had to become so kind of dynamic and quick in the way that we use, and I suppose creative in the way that we use technology, that will open our minds to the fact that we can be using technology more fluently and embed it into our day-to-day teaching, because technology, in my opinion, unlocks a lot of the difficulties for dyslexic learners and actually makes life so much easier. And I'm going to mention some of those a little bit later. So processing information I've mentioned. So it's all about how an individual processes information. That's one of the reasons I know a couple of you wrote in the chat they struggle to finish the work. Usually that's to do with processing information, and it can be to do with reading and writing speed as well. Sequencing is a major difficulty with dyslexic learners. As humans, it is human nature that we try to organize information in our brains. So whether we think we do or not, we do that. So we group categories, we link ideas, we sequence patterns, and we try and work through things logically in most cases. And dyslexic pupils struggle with that. They find it difficult with sequencing and organizing information, and they're not efficient when they're trying to remember information, and that makes it really difficult. I'm going to drill down into each of these in much more detail in a moment, so don't worry if you think I'm going quickly through them. I'm coming back to them in a minute. Okay, memory. So poor short-term and working memory is really, really common. But often, I think it was Maria that said, you try and bypass everything and get to the long-term memory. That's a really good strategy, because trying to get a pupil to embed information into their long-term memory will mean that it stays there for a very, very long time compared to short-term and working memory. And I'll talk about that in more detail in a moment as well. Spelling, we know a couple of you mentioned, sort of letter reversal, confusing words like homophones, spellings of homophones and things like that. Spelling is really difficult for dyslexic learners, and that is partly because they find sequencing difficult. So and also there's very frequently an inconsistent use of the same letters. So sounds like s and z, so S and Z, and f would be an F or a PH spelling. The phonemes sound the same, but the graphemes are different. So it's that phoneme to grapheme correspondence, the letter to sound correspondence is really tricky. Add into that sequencing difficulties, the order in which things go. Add into that processing information, it takes a long time for it to go in because of the processing difficulty and a difficulty with the mechanics of their phonological loop within their brain that is proven, and add in their short-term working memory, and you can see why it's so hard. This is not a surprise when we break it down like this. And then we're asking these children to try and deliver that knowledge and prove what they've learned to us through writing fluency, which is really hard. And I feel so sorry for them. And ultimately, it's our job to help them to overcome these difficulties and be their advocates and do the most we possibly can for them. And hopefully kind of my passion for that will come through in this workshop. So just finally, on writing fluency, there's difficulty with something called automaticity, which is getting the information and retrieving the information from the working memory and then using spellings and organizing and sequencing information, all of that. So all of these other bits here, I hope you can see my mouse moving, maybe you can't, but all of the sort of, so the top, so reading difficulties, processing information, sequencing memory and spelling, all feed into writing fluency. That's why it's so tricky. So I'm going to zone in on reading difficulties now. So I want you to feel totally clear on the most common difficulties dyslexic learners experience, and we're going to drill down into the first difficulty, which is reading difficulties. So our dyslexic pupils have difficulty recognizing and remembering word sounds. They find it difficult to skim read and will prefer to read within context wherever they can. And usually they will substitute words with similar meanings or spellings. So sort of form or from, where and were. You'll see difficulties with homophones probably on a daily basis. I do so much work on homophones for that reason. So a definite difficulty with knowing which spelling of the same sounding word to put into a text. Often there'll be difficulty to read for accuracy and meaning at the same time. Quite often reading is quite labored and slow. And because, an individual with dyslexia is trying so hard to decode words, then it's really difficult to then work out what it means at the same time. That's why a dyslexic learner will often say, I can read it, it's fine, but I have to go back and read it 2 or 3 times because I don't really know what's happened when I get to the end of the line or the end of the paragraph. That's really, really common. Often they'll lose their place when reading. Now, I know somebody mentioned about visual stress. That could be a visual difficulty. So again, there's a whole loads of training on that in the membership, but lose their place when reading is common. And again, that's because they're not necessarily taking in what they're reading, and therefore they're not looking for the next natural word after that, the end of that line. They're just kind of robotically going from one line to another. So that's really tricky too. Difficulty pronouncing multisyllabic words. So phonemic decoding, if you have a sequencing difficulty and a decoding difficulty, and you're not secure on the phoneme, grapheme, so the phonemes and the grapheme correspondence, so what does each sound like and read as, then of course, when you're trying to decode multisyllabic words, that's a real challenge, particularly for sort of key stage 1, key stage 2 pupils who are learning to read. Poor word attack skills is common, so hesitating around new unknown words. You'll see that across all the key stages, but I see it a lot. I mean, I'm a secondary trained, although I have taught primary level, but I find secondary pupils' word attack skills will be highlighted when they're trying to learn new vocabulary within a subject topic. So suddenly there'll be hesitation around some unknown words and decoding of those. They may misread questions because their reading accuracy is not necessarily very high. So I see a lot of pupils who will read a question and completely misunderstand actually what the question stem meant, and they will go off and form an answer and structure an answer, but it will be off the point and it's not actually answering the question. So then marks can be lost, and that's a real difficulty. So highlighting and using study skills to unveil what a question stem is asking a pupil is absolutely crucial, and I'm going to come on to those strategies later. You might see slow reading speed with little expressions, particularly when you're working with younger pupils. It can happen with older pupils too. That's not distinct to key stage 1 or early readers. And a reluctance to read. I so often hear the pupils that I work with being told by subject teachers, oh, you just need to read more. You need to read as much as possible. You know, my daughter who's aged 8, one of my daughters, is coming into the Easter holidays, and her teacher said to her, you know, just keep reading, read all holiday. Now that's fine if you're neurotypical and you enjoy reading, but if you hate reading and your teacher is saying to you, just read this holiday, that's not massively helpful, because already you feel like you're not doing something you should do. So, you know, just things to consider. So I'm going to drill down now into sort of difficulties with processing information. And then I'm going to come on to difficulties with sequencing here. So on the right. So the difficulties with processing information. So dyslexia involves more than just a difficulty with reading. Obviously, it affects learning and how all information is processed, which I touched upon a bit earlier. Difficulties with taking in information. So how is that information kind of processed? How is it memorized? And then how do we display to others that we know that information? That's really tricky. And then often we take longer, dyslexic pupils take longer to read, process, interpret, and analyze information. So comprehension tasks, for example, or analytical tasks, or designing a creative writing piece that's got to build in excitement as it goes through. All of those are really difficult because they involve processing. And then subsequently, a pupil will quite often miss the next steps within a lesson and not get as deep into their learning as their peers, because they're trying to keep up with what's happening within the lesson with their processing difficulty. So they're trying to read something you already set them 10 minutes ago. It's taking them longer than the pupil, you know, the two pupils next to them. That's building frustration. They're trying not to lose confidence and concentration. They're trying to get through the piece of work you've asked them to do. And then because we move quite quickly within our classrooms, next thing, oh, Miss or Sir is moving on to a different activity, and suddenly I'm only halfway through the first one. That's really demoralizing. It's really that really sort of promotes a loss in confidence, and it is also means they don't get as deep into their learning. I hope that makes sense. So difficulties with sequencing, that usually means that phonemes within words are mixed up when they're read or spelt. So for example, if a child is trying to spell a multisyllabic word, I don't know, maybe necessary, for example, which I'm going to come on to in a moment, then when they're trying to spell necessary, they get into a muddle because the sequencing skills are not strong, and therefore they can't work out necessarily which way it should be and how it should be spelt. So that's a commonly misspelt word. Can mispronounce multisyllabic words quite often. I mean, there's countless numbers of ones I could come up with. My brain's frozen, so if anyone can think of multisyllabic words, put it in the chat. Specific is one, specific and Pacific, that's quite oftenly mispronounced, but there's plenty of them that go on, so I'm sure you can think of some. It's a real challenge to organize a sequence of a story and organize information, so that's what I was referring to with the creative writing activity. A sequencing difficulty will often relate to words and reading and writing rather than logical thought. Now, I assess and diagnose for dyslexia, and what I often see is that the kind of logical deduction skills of a pupil or an individual with dyslexia are strong, and they will quite often, if they have you know, an average IQ or an above average IQ, which is exceedingly common for a pupil with dyslexia, they will have an amazing skill in logical deduction. So they'll be able to work out how pattern works, often how problem solve very easily, because they kind of approach these sort of challenges from a different angle. So that's really common to see strengths in that area. So we're going to drill down into difficulties with memory and then difficulties with spelling on the right-hand side. So with memory, it's difficult to hold a list of instructions in the memory, and pupils will get confused very easily. So if you said to I don't know, George, could you go down to room 13 for me, please? Could you ask Mr. Jones to get me the green book from the second drawer down and bring it back to me as quick as you can? George, did I say he was called George? I'm not sure. Whatever I called him, George will be still trying to process the first set of instructions, which was go and ask Mr. Jones something. So he will be asking, oh, miss, sorry, could you repeat that? Or he might just not feel confident to ask you to repeat it. And he might just go and see Mr. Jones anyway and ask for the wrong item or something like that. And it's really common that you hear teachers saying, you know, George just doesn't listen. He doesn't listen hard enough. He doesn't listen carefully. He never seems to know what I'm doing in the lesson. He's easily distracted. Well, that's because George has got a processing difficulty. So he's trying to take information in, and he also can't hold a list of instructions in his memory. And often the way we teach is builds on from one thing to another. So we develop activities through the lesson as our knowledge in our pupils builds up. But if they haven't got the foundations of those bits of information, it's really difficult to hold that in the memory and then add it on to the later parts of the lesson and the later tasks. I hope that makes sense. Some of this I'm explaining as I go, but hopefully you get the idea. So often a pupil with dyslexia will have difficulty arriving at an overview of a complex situation. Again, that could be processing speed. It could be to do with holding information in the working memory, which is basically like your desktop. So it kind of holds something there, like a phone number or instructions. You hold those informations, that information in your working memory. Often they'll have difficulty independently starting or completing a task. When they have difficulty starting a task, usually that's because they're trying to put everything in order and sequence to get to to complete the activity you ask them to do. And completing a task is often because they can't necessarily remember what you asked them to do, or there's a processing difficulty. And the pupil often has difficulty remembering factual knowledge and procedural knowledge, and difficulty transferring concepts. So just because you've taught something in English doesn't necessarily mean that pupil will be able to link it across to something in geography to do with question stems or something like that. That's not often information that's transferred. So that's quite tricky. With spelling, sequencing means that words are often misspelt, like I've talked about already, and it's really hard to get sounds in the right order. Processing difficulty can mean that it's hard to decode a multisyllabic word. Trying to sort out the individual sounds within a word and verbalize them can be difficult. And it can be a real challenge when it comes to homophones. I'm sure that happens in every classroom. And severely dyslexic pupils will literally spell the words as they sound. Now, I know young children do that. I know that. But this will probably be more persistent. And actually, the English language is I think, well, I'm just saying something off the top of my head now. Might be totally wrong. There's no research that I'm aware of covering this statement. But as far as I'm aware, English is the most difficult language in the world to learn. And I'm not surprised that dyslexic pupils find it so difficult to know which sound to use. I mean, ridiculous. And often with spelling, there'll be difficulties remembering spelling rules and common spellings. Okay, so I'm going to have a little slurp on my tea as we're halfway through. Just have a look in the chat, see what you're all talking about. Anybody got any comments or questions on that so far? Let's have a look. So, friend's daughter can undertake 2 instructions, add any more, and she doesn't do any of them and walks away. Yeah, that's processing difficulty, Maria. So, I think we all sort of can understand and relate to how that feels when we're tired. I don't know about you guys, but if I'm tired and somebody asks me a lot of information, I have a bit of a shutdown. When I'm in a sort of normal frame of mind, I'm perfectly fine. But if I'm tired or it's the end of the day, I kind of haven't got any more to give, and I shut down too. And I'd like to walk away on many situations when somebody asks me to do lots of things all in one go. So yeah, just let me have a quick drink. Good. So I hope that's making sense so far. Moving on. Okay. Where are we? Okay. Oh, good. It's over to you. I can have a rest. Okay. So I want you to be thinking about the strengths that you see that your dyslexic learners experience. So this is really, really important. And I'm going to be doing a lot of work over the next 4 to 6 weeks within the membership on growth mindset and strategies to grow self-esteem, grow self-confidence, resources that I know are really helpful to develop that. But growth mindset is really important. And And I think one of the ways to make sure that we understand strengths and how to develop those using a growth mindset, or develop weaknesses using a growth mindset, is by knowing the strengths of our individual learners. So I'll give you a couple of minutes for this. And if you can write in the chat again, what do you perceive or observe are the usual strengths of your learners who are dyslexic? So what do you commonly see are as strengths? So Wilna says creativity. 100% creativity is major, absolutely major. And that's a massive advantage. So, okay, strengths, puzzles, 3D puzzles. Yes, so that was kind of the visual decoding, sort of visual perception, kind of, yeah, that's the strength I was talking about earlier, the visual skills. Imagining and then building something, yeah, amazing. Practical skills, construction, Jennifer, definitely. Maths, very common, yeah. Very creative, Sally, yes. Definitely artistic most of the time. Very strong math skills, puzzles, great verbal answers to questions, yeah, completely, Olivia. Good, often good at PE, yeah, often have really good sort of spatial awareness skills, and that's what makes them good at PE, in my opinion. So that's kind of to do with this sort of problem solving overview, creativity that they have, and being able to see, you know, sort of the way that a game is being played and strategies within a game, that's often a real skill. Musical, definitely. Imaginative story ideas, yeah, thinking outside the box. Something crazy, again, don't quote me, but something like 66% of the world's millionaires, probably more likely, are dyslexic. And that is because they have this ability to think outside the box. And if they can overcome their difficulties and become and develop a lot of perseverance and self-confidence by working around their difficulties, then they develop this ability to think outside the box. So it doesn't surprise me at all that a lot of millionaires are dyslexic. Think Richard Branson, for example. Being hands-on, using physical resources, creative, yeah, great imagination, strong in sports, good peripheral vision, yeah, so can base answers on probability, a confidence to take a chance, try things, yeah, amazing. So these skills are definitely the areas that we as teachers and parents and trusted adults need to heavily promote and push. So, you know, if ever we were going to be pushy parents, we should be pushy parents and pushy teachers in those areas, because those are, it's kind of like a path. I see it in my head as like a path unfolding in front of a dyslexic pupil, because suddenly, you know, if they think they're not very good at everything generally, which is common when they're a bit younger, if we can start them to see that actually, you know what, you're amazing at sport. Look how amazing you are at singing. Look how creative you are, you know, creating videos using that software, editing software, whatever it is, we need to show them the way for that. And I'm not even going to get started because I'll just go on about that for hours, but that's really important. I'm just going to come back to a question that Sally asked me earlier. What do I mean by question stem? So question stem, just in case anyone else had that question, a question stem is, so basically, what is the question actually asking you? So I'm talking probably a bit more like secondary pupils. So analyze the difference between would be a question stem. So I hope that kind of explains that. So, you know, they've got to highlight the word between, because it's talking about two different elements. You can't just analyze one part of that. You've got to analyze both parts. That's what I mean by question stem. Anyway, yeah, so amazing, really good. You're welcome, Sally. Really good insight into what our dyslexic pupils find easier and what they're amazing at. And we need to just focus every single day on promoting their strengths. That's absolutely key. Okay. So sometimes dyslexia really is a gift. And like I said, dyslexia is a challenge because we assess and grade our pupils, and we assess, grade our pupils on their ability to learn information, process information, retain information, and then put those ideas in writing. So as I've kind of hopefully highlighted to you, that's really difficult. So judging them solely on their weakest areas is problematic. And that's what gives so many teachers and the general population, I think, this kind of perception that dyslexia means that somebody isn't intelligent, when actually it's completely the opposite. Most of the time, dyslexic learners have an average or above average IQ, and it's something within their brain function. It's proven within MRI scans that actually there are parts of the brain that don't work as well when a pupil has dyslexia. It is a physical difficulty as well. So really, really important that we get clear on what their gifts are. So I've just come up with some here. So starting at the top, 12 o'clock, great vocabulary, excellent problem solving skills, amazing at logical deduction most of the time. And again, I think that's what helps sport as well. Strong abstract reasoning quite often, strong general knowledge. Some, if they do enjoy reading about general knowledge and things like that, and it goes into the long-term memory, that will never leave. Often excellent listening skills, but mostly I see that they're very artistic and creative. Excuse me. One of the things I'll just tell you really quickly about my husband, he won't mind me telling you, he's severely dyslexic. He is a welding engineer now. He's done really well in his life and loves his job more than most people I know. Like, he genuinely loves going to work every day. I discovered about a year ago, I ask him probing questions all the time, which he finds really annoying. What do you think about that? How do you see this? But he can, which I definitely can't. I don't know about you guys. He can look at a piece of equipment on the floor, on the ground, like a piece of metal, a machine or something, and he can visualize it being lifted into the air and turned around the other side so he can see it from the other angle, obviously once he's been around the whole thing. So he can actually pick up this kind of, visualize picking up this machine and turning it around in a 3D kind of motion and looking at it from the other side. Now that just blows my brain, because I can't, there's no way I could do any of that. And that's what I'm talking about this kind of artistic and creative and logical deduction and abstract thought. That's a massive skill, and that's why he's just so good at his job. So really worth kind of thinking about that.